I've been driving trucks for over 2 decades, and I've seen some strange things on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me that night on Route 66. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about it. It was a crisp October night, the kind where the air feels electric and the moon hangs low and heavy in the sky. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Los Angeles, making good time on the historic Route 66. The cab of my Peterbilt was quiet, save for the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. Around 2 a.m., I hit a stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. Nothing but dark fields and the occasional abandoned gas station for miles. That's when I first noticed her in my headlights, a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, standing on the shoulder with her thumb out. Now, I'm not the type to pick up hitchhikers. It's too risky in this day and age. But something about her made me slow down. Maybe it was the late hour, or the isolated location. Or maybe it was the way she looked, wearing a white dress that seemed out of place for hitchhiking, her long dark hair blowing in a wind I couldn't feel inside my cab. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. "Where are you headed?" I called out as I leaned across the passenger seat to open the door. "Los Angeles," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Is that where you're going?" I nodded and she climbed in. Up close, I noticed how pale she was, almost ghostly in the dim light of the cab. But her eyes were bright, alert. "I'm John," I said, pulling back onto the empty highway. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied, staring straight ahead. "Thank you for stopping. I've been waiting a long time." There was something odd about the way she said it, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. It was the middle of the night, after all. "What brings you out here all alone?" I asked, trying to make conversation. Sarah was quiet for a moment before answering. "I'm trying to get home. I've been away for a while." I nodded, not wanting to pry. We drove in silence for a few miles, the white lines of the road hypnotic in the darkness. I was about to turn on the radio when Sarah spoke again. "Do you believe in ghosts, John?" The question caught me off guard. I've never really thought about it," I stammered. "Why do you ask?" She turned to look at me, and for a split second I could have sworn her eyes reflected the light like a cat's. "Because sometimes the past doesn't want to stay buried." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a laugh. "That's a bit heavy for small talk, don't you think?" Sarah didn't respond. When I glanced over, she was staring out the window, her reflection faint against the glass. We continued on in silence. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. The air in the cab felt colder, and the shadows seemed deeper. After about an hour, we approached a small town. The sign read Elk City as we passed. I decided to pull into a 24-hour truck stop, needing coffee and a chance to stretch my legs. "You want anything?" I asked Sarah as I pulled into a parking spot. No response. I turned to look at her and felt my blood run cold. The passenger seat was empty. I blinked hard, my mind racing. Had I imagined her? Was I so tired that I'd hallucinated an entire passenger? But no, I could still smell a faint floral scent, like old-fashioned perfume. With shaking hands, I got out of the truck and looked around the parking lot. No sign of Sarah. I even checked the sleeper cab, half expecting to find her hiding there. Nothing. Inside the truck stop, I ordered the strongest coffee they had and tried to calm my nerves. The grizzled cashier must have noticed my agitation. "You all right there, driver? Look like you've seen a ghost," he chuckled. I forced a smile. "Just a long night," I replied. But as I turned to leave, a framed newspaper article on the wall caught my eye. It was yellowed with age, but the black and white photo was clear as day. It was Sarah. My hands shook as I read the headline, "Local woman vanishes on Route 66, October 1957. The article told the story of Sarah Thompson, a 23-year-old who disappeared while traveling to Los Angeles to pursue an acting career. Her car was found abandoned near Elk City, but Sarah was never seen again. The photo showed her smiling, wearing the same white dress I'd seen her in not an hour ago. I stumbled back to my truck in a daze, my mind reeling. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be real, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. As I climbed back into the cab, something on the passenger seat caught my eye. A single white flower, an Oklahoma rose, I'd later learn, lay where Sarah had been sitting. Its petals were as fresh as if it had just been picked, despite the fact that these flowers didn't bloom in October. I don't remember much of the rest of that drive. I white-knuckled it all the way to California, jumping at every shadow and unable to shake the feeling of being watched. When I finally delivered my load, I took a week off trying to make sense of what had happened. In the years since, I've driven Route 66 many times. I've never seen Sarah again, but sometimes when I pass through Oklahoma in the dead of night, I catch a whiff of that floral perfume. And every October, no matter where I am, I find a single white rose waiting for me in my truck. I've done my research since then. Turns out I'm not the only one who's encountered Sarah. There are stories going back decades of a young woman in a white dress hitchhiking along Route 66, always vanishing before reaching her destination. Some say she's still trying to get to Hollywood, forever chasing her dream. Others think she's looking for the person responsible for her disappearance. Me? I don't know what to believe anymore. But I do know that there are things out there that can't be explained. Things that challenge everything we think we understand about the world. And on lonely stretches of highway in the dead of night, sometimes the line between the living and the dead gets a little blurry. I still drive trucks. It's in my blood. But I've changed since that night. I'm more aware of the world around me, more open to the possibilities of what might exist beyond our understanding. And every time I pass a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I say a little prayer for them, for Sarah, and for myself. Because out there on the endless ribbon of asphalt with nothing but darkness and the hum of your engine for company, you never know what you might encounter. And some passengers, well, they stick with you long after the ride is over. So if you ever find yourself driving down Route 66 on a moonlit night and see a young woman in a white dress with her thumb out, think twice before stopping. But if you do pick her up, pay attention. You might just learn something about the mysteries of life, death, and the long, lonely road that connects them. As for me, I'll keep driving, keep watching, and keep wondering. Because once you've had a brush with the inexplicable, you never see the world quite the same way again. And somewhere out there, on a dusty stretch of America's most famous highway, Sarah is still waiting for her ride home. They say long-haul trucking is a lonely job, but let me tell you, there are times when you'd give anything to be alone on the road. I found that out the hard way on a run from Phoenix to Chicago, on a night that stretched into a waking nightmare. 500 miles of terror with death riding my bumper the whole way. It started on a Tuesday evening in late November. I just picked up a load of computer parts from a warehouse on the outskirts of Phoenix, settling in for the long haul ahead. The sun was setting as I pulled onto I-40 East, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I'd had the time to appreciate them. About an hour into the drive, just past Flagstaff, I first noticed the truck behind me. Nothing unusual about that, we're always leapfrogging each other on these long stretches. But something about this one caught my eye. It was an older model, maybe from the 70s, all black with no logos or identifying marks. The windows were tinted so dark they looked opaque, even in the glare of my taillights. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the miles ticked by, I realized it was always there, hanging about 100 yards back. No matter how I varied my speed, it maintained that exact distance. Too close to be coincidence, too far to make out any details. By the time we crossed into New Mexico, my neck was stiff from checking my mirrors every few seconds. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it. Maybe they were just being cautious, keeping a safe distance. But there was something off about the whole situation. The way the truck moved, it was almost too smooth, like it was gliding rather than driving. I tried changing lanes, but it mirrored my movements precisely. I sped up, pushing past the speed limit, but it accelerated in perfect sync. When I slowed down, so did it, always maintaining that 100-yard gap. As we approached Albuquerque, my palms were sweating on the wheel. I decided to pull into a rest stop, figuring whatever was going on, I could shake it off there. I took the exit, heart pounding as I watched my mirrors. The black truck sailed past the exit without slowing. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, pulled into a parking spot and just sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm my nerves. Told myself I'd been imagining things, letting the monotony of the road get to me. I went inside, splashed some water on my face, grabbed a coffee. By the time I got back to my rig, I'd almost convinced myself it was all in my head. Then I pulled back onto the highway and there it was, waiting 100 yards back, as if it had never left. My blood ran cold. This wasn't possible. There was no way it could have gotten behind me again without me noticing. Yet there it was, its presence oppressive even at a distance. I got on the CB, trying to keep my voice steady. Breaker 1-9, this is Long Haul Larry. Anybody got eyes on a black truck, older model, riding east on I-40? Over. Silence, not even static. I tried again, switching channels. Nothing. It was like the radio was dead. That's when the fear really set in. I was alone out here, being stalked by something that didn't follow the rules of reality. My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or was there something truly supernatural happening? As we crossed into Texas, a heavy fog rolled in. The kind that turns the world into a gray soup where your headlights just bounce back at you. I slowed down, squinting to make out the road ahead. But in my mirrors, those headlights remained clear as day, cutting through the mist like it wasn't even there. I white-knuckled it across the Texas Panhandle, watching the gas gauge drop lower and lower. I was afraid to stop, but I knew I'd have to eventually. Just outside Amarillo, the needle was hovering near empty. I had no choice. Heart in my throat, I pulled into a truck stop. As I filled up, I kept my eyes glued to the highway, no sign of the black truck. I paid at the pump, not wanting to leave my rig for a second longer than I had to. Back on the road, I made it about 5 miles before I saw it. Headlights in my mirror emerging from the fog. My stomach dropped. I knew without a doubt it was the same truck, back to resume its silent pursuit. We entered Oklahoma with the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. I'd been driving for nearly 20 hours straight, fueled by fear and gas station coffee. My eyes burned, my back ached, but I didn't dare stop again. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the prairie, I got my first clear look at my pursuer in the daylight. What I saw made me wish for the concealing darkness of night. The black paint was scarred and pitted like it had driven through acid rain. The chrome was tarnished, more black than silver, and there were symbols painted on the side. Not words or letters, but jagged alien shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. But the worst part was the driver's side window. In the clear light of day, I could see it wasn't tinted at all. It was empty. There was no one behind the wheel. I started laughing then, a high, hysterical sound that bounced around my cab. I was hallucinating. I had to be. Sleep deprivation and stress had finally cracked my mind wide open. But hallucination or not, that truck was still there, still following, still waiting. We blew through Oklahoma City in the mid-morning traffic. I weaved between cars, taking exits at random, doubling back on service roads, anything to shake my pursuer. But every time I thought I'd lost it, there it was, materializing out of the traffic like a bad dream. By the time we hit the Missouri border, I was running on fumes, physically and mentally. My hands shook as I clutched the wheel, and dark spots danced at the edges of my vision. But I was afraid to sleep, afraid to even blink. Somewhere in the rolling hills of Missouri, around hour 30 of this nightmare drive, things started to get weird. Weirder, I mean. The black truck started to flicker, like a bad TV signal. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't, then back again. The road ahead seemed to stretch and warp, miles compressing into yards, then snapping back. I checked my GPS and nearly drove off the road in shock. According to it, I'd traveled over 1,500 miles in the past hour. That was impossible, wasn't it? As we approached St. Louis, the sky darkened, not the gradual fading of sunset, but a sudden unnatural twilight. The temperature in my cab plummeted. I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The black truck was closer now, maybe 50 yards back. Its headlights blazed with a sickly green light that hurt to look at. The symbols on its side seemed to crawl and shift, rearranging themselves into new, horrifying configurations. I was nearing my breaking point. Exhaustion, fear, and confusion had worn away my sanity, leaving me raw and exposed. As we crossed the Mississippi, I made a decision born of desperation. I was going to confront whatever this thing was. Just past East St. Louis, I saw my chance. An abandoned rest stop, overgrown and forgotten. I took the exit hard, tires squealing, pulled into the crumbling parking lot and slammed on the brakes, nearly jackknifing as I came to a stop. I leapt from the cab, legs wobbly after so long sitting, turned to face the entrance, ready to face my tormentor. Nothing came. I stood there for what felt like hours, though my watch only ticked off minutes. The silence was absolute, not even the sound of distant traffic breaking it. Just me, my ragged breathing, and the derelict rest stop slowly being reclaimed by nature. Finally, I slumped to the ground, back against my truck's warm tire. The adrenaline drained from my system, leaving me hollow and spent. I don't know how long I sat there, hovering on the edge of consciousness. A hand on my shoulder snapped me back to alertness. I looked up, heart pounding, into the face of a state trooper. "You all right, sir?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "We got a call about a truck driving erratically. Been looking for you for a while." I opened my mouth, closed it. Where to even begin? How to explain the inexplicable? In the end, I just nodded, let him help me to my feet, accepted the ride to the nearest hospital where they diagnosed me with extreme fatigue and possible hallucinations due to sleep deprivation. I never saw the black truck again after that night. Never told the full story to anyone who wasn't paid to listen and nod sympathetically. But I've heard whispers, snippets of similar tales from other drivers. Always a black truck, always at night, always for exactly 500 miles. I still drive. Had to get back on the horse or I'd never work again. But I don't do long hauls anymore, nothing over 400 miles, and I never drive at night if I can help it. Because out there on the dark highway and the spaces between cities and streetlights, there are things that defy explanation, things that hunt, and sometimes they follow you home. I've been driving trucks for 30 years and I've seen things on the road that would make your hair stand on end. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me last winter on I-80 through Nebraska. It was the night I learned that sometimes the ones who are supposed to keep us safe on the highways, well, they might not be as alive as you'd think. It was a bitter cold January night, the kind where the wind howls across the plains like a banshee and the snow blows sideways. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Salt Lake City, fighting to keep my rig on the road as the blizzard raged around me. About an hour east of North Platte, my dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. Engine trouble. I managed to limp the truck onto the shoulder, but I knew I was in for a long, cold wait. Cell service was non-existent, and in this weather it might be hours before another vehicle passed by. I settled in, cranking up the heat and pulling my thermos of coffee from the cup holder. That's when I saw the lights in my mirror, red and blue cutting through the swirling snow. Highway patrol. Relief washed over me. Sure, they couldn't fix my truck, but at least I wouldn't be alone out here in the howling dark. The cruiser pulled up behind me, its spotlight momentarily blinding me as it swept across my mirrors. I watched as a figure emerged from the vehicle, moving with an odd, stiff gait towards my cab. As the officer approached, something felt off. His uniform looked outdated, like something from the 70s or 80s, and despite the brutal wind and driving snow, he wasn't wearing a coat. A knock on my door made me jump. I rolled down the window, prepared to explain my situation. The words died in my throat as I got my first good look at the officer's face. His skin was pale, almost blue in the harsh light of my cab. His eyes were sunken, dark hollows that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. And when he spoke, his breath didn't fog in the freezing air. "License and registration," he said, his voice a dry whisper that somehow carried over the howling wind. My hands shook as I fumbled for my paperwork. "Oh, officer," I stammered, "I'm having some engine trouble. I was hoping you might be able to call for a tow truck." He didn't respond, just stared at me with those bottomless eyes. After what felt like an eternity, he handed back my documents. "You need to move along," he said. "It's not safe here." I tried to explain that I couldn't move, that my engine was shot. But he just repeated, "Move along," in that same whisper-dry voice. Then he turned and walked back to his cruiser, his movements jerky and unnatural. I watched in my mirror as he got back in his vehicle. The lights flashed once, twice, and then the cruiser was gone, vanishing into the snowy night as if it had never been there at all. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the wind anymore. What the hell had just happened? Was I hallucinating from the cold? I pinched myself hard, but nothing changed. The spot where the cruiser had been was empty, not even tire tracks in the fresh-fallen snow. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a regular cop and the weird appearance was a trick of the light in my tired eyes. Maybe he was just in a hurry to get out of the storm, but deep down I knew better. There had been something fundamentally wrong about that officer, something that went beyond the rational world I thought I knew. As I sat there, my mind racing, a new sound cut through the howling wind, a deep, rhythmic rumbling growing louder by the second. Headlights appeared in my mirror, and I felt a surge of relief as I saw a snowplow approaching. The massive vehicle pulled up behind me, and a burly man in a thick winter coat climbed down from the cab. He trudged through the snow to my window, shouting to be heard over the storm. "You all right in there?" he called. "Saw you sitting here and thought I'd check. Nasty night to be broken down." I nodded, grateful for the normal human interaction. "Engine trouble," I explained. "Been waiting for a tow, but cell service is out." The plow driver frowned. "You're lucky I came by. We're not supposed to be out in this. They closed the highway about an hour ago, just east of here. Didn't you see the signs?" I shook my head, confused. No signs, and a highway patrolman was just here. He didn't say anything about the road being closed. The man's frown deepened. "That's not possible. There's no patrol out tonight, too dangerous. And like I said, the highway's closed. Has been for a while." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. "But I saw him," I insisted. "He checked my license and everything." The plow driver gave me a long look, then sighed. "Listen," he said, his voice low and serious. "I don't usually like talking about this, but you're not the first trucker to tell me something like this. There's stories, you see, about a stretch of I-80 right around here." He glanced around as if making sure we were alone, then continued. "Back in '83, there was a horrible pileup. Whiteout conditions just like tonight. One of the vehicles involved was a highway patrol cruiser. Officer didn't make it. Ever since then, people have reported seeing a patrol car on nights like this, pulling over stranded motorists, telling them to move along. Some folks say it's the ghost of that officer still trying to do his job, keep people safe on the road." I felt the blood drain from my face as the plow driver spoke. It fit. The outdated uniform, the odd behavior, the way the cruiser had vanished. But I didn't want to believe it. Ghosts weren't real. They couldn't be. The plow driver must have seen the disbelief on my face. He shrugged. "Hey, I'm just telling you what I've heard. Believe it or not, that's up to you. But right now, we need to get you out of here. This storm's only getting worse." He offered to tow my truck to the nearest town with his plow. As he was hooking up the tow cable, I could have sworn I saw lights in the distance, red and blue cutting through the snow. But when I blinked, they were gone. The next few hours were a blur of howling wind and swirling snow as we crawled along the empty highway. We finally made it to a small town just before dawn, the plow driver dropping me and my truck off at a service station that doubled as a motel. As I checked in, the clerk gave me an odd look. "You're lucky," she said. "Highway's been closed since yesterday afternoon. How'd you get through?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it. How could I possibly describe what had happened? In the harsh fluorescent light of the motel office, it all seemed impossible, like a bad dream brought on by too many hours on the road. "Just lucky, I guess," I mumbled, taking my room key. "That was 5 years ago. I still drive that route sometimes when I have to, but I always make sure to stop well before North Platte if there's even a hint of snow in the forecast. And on dark, stormy nights when the wind is howling across the Nebraska plains, I sometimes catch myself watching my mirrors, half expecting to see those red and blue lights appearing out of nowhere. I've never seen that highway patrolman again, but sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and the road is empty, I'll feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. And I'll remember that there are things out there on the lonely highways that can't be explained. Things that might look like they're there to help you, but are really just echoes of tragedy, endlessly repeating. So if you're ever driving through Nebraska on I-80 and you see patrol lights in your mirror on a snowy night, do yourself a favor. Don't pull over. Don't stop. Just keep driving and hope that whatever's out there doesn't decide to follow you home. Because out on the highway, not everything is as it seems. And sometimes the ones who are supposed to protect us are the ones we need to fear the most. They say every trucker has that one run they'll never forget. For me, it wasn't the coast-to-coast hauls or the treacherous mountain passes that stuck with me. It was a seemingly ordinary stretch of highway through the Mojave Desert, where the line between the living and the dead blurs like a mirage on the horizon. It was the night I learned that some sounds can haunt you long after they've faded away. It was mid-July and I was hauling a load of produce from California to Texas, the kind of run I'd done 100 times before. But as I crossed into Nevada on a moonless night, the air thick with summer heat, I had no idea that this trip would be anything but routine. I'd been driving for about 14 hours, pushing hard to make my delivery window. The road ahead was empty, a black ribbon stretching endlessly into the darkness. My only company was the hum of my engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. As the clock on my dash clicked over to 11:59 p.m., I felt a change in the air. It was subtle at first, like the pressure drop before a storm. But out here in the desert, the sky was clear, stars twinkling coldly overhead. The moment my clock hit midnight, I heard it. A truck horn, loud and clear, coming from somewhere behind me. I checked my mirrors, but the road behind was as empty as the one ahead. Probably just hearing things, I muttered to myself, shaking my head to clear it. Long hours on the road can play tricks on your mind after all. But then it came again. Louder this time, closer. 2 long blasts like a warning. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something about that sound was wrong. It echoed in a way that didn't make sense in the open desert, lingering in the air long after it should have faded. I keyed my mic. Breaker 1, 9, this is Big Red. Anybody else out here on I-15 southbound? Silence, not even static. The horn blared again, and this time I could have sworn I felt it vibrate through my seat. I pressed down on the accelerator, my heart racing. In my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of something. Headlights way too high off the ground, closing fast. I blinked and they were gone. But the horn kept coming, every minute, on the minute, each time louder, each time closer. By 12:15, I was doing 90, my rig shuddering with the effort. The horn was so loud now it drowned out my engine, each blast sending vibrations through my whole body. In the gaps between, I could hear something else, a sound like metal grinding on metal, punctuated by screams that no human throat could make. At 12:20, I saw a sign for a rest stop ahead. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely control the wheel, but I managed to take the exit. As I pulled into the deserted parking lot, the horn gave one final deafening blast. Then silence fell, so complete and sudden it was like being plunged underwater. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, too terrified to move. Eventually, I worked up the courage to step out of my cab on shaky legs. The desert night was quiet, just the faint buzz of insects and the ping of my cooling engine. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something odd about the rest stop. It looked old, run down in a way that went beyond simple neglect. The sign was faded to near illegibility, and the buildings looked like they hadn't seen maintenance in decades. I approached the main building cautiously, fumbling for the flashlight I kept in my jacket. The beam revealed peeling paint and boarded-up windows, but there, barely visible beneath years of dust and grime, was a poster. My blood ran cold as I read the faded text. Truck driver wanted in connection with fatal hit and run. July 15, 1972. Suspect vehicle, black Peterbilt 359, last seen on I-15 near Sloan, Nevada. My mind reeled. Today was July 15th, exactly 50 years later. A sound behind me made me whirl around, heart pounding. There, at the edge of the parking lot, was a truck. A black Peterbilt 359, its chrome gleaming impossibly bright in the starlight. It looked brand new, like it had just rolled off the assembly line. But there was something off about it. The edges seemed blurred, like I was seeing it through a heat haze. As I watched, frozen in terror, the driver's side door swung open. I caught a glimpse of movement inside the cab, a shape that was almost human, but not quite. Then the horn blared, louder than anything I'd heard before, loud enough to drive me to my knees with my hands clamped over my ears. When I looked up again, the truck was gone. But in the dirt where it had been, I saw fresh tire tracks. I don't remember getting back in my truck. Don't remember pulling back onto the highway or driving through the rest of that endless night. I came back to myself somewhere in Arizona, the rising sun burning away the last of the shadows. I called my dispatcher as soon as I had cell service, told her I was taking a personal day. Found the nearest motel and holed up there, trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced was just a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research, spent hours in libraries and online, digging through old newspapers and police reports. And I found it. a small article buried in the back pages of a Las Vegas paper from 1972. Unidentified motorist killed in late-night collision. Witnesses report black semi-truck fled the scene. The article went on to say that despite an extensive search, the truck and its driver were never found. The case went cold, another unsolved mystery in the vastness of the desert. I've thought a lot about that night in the years since, about the driver of that black Peterbilt, forever reliving his fatal mistake, about the victim whose justice was denied, and I've wondered, was what I experienced a warning, a cry for help, or something darker, a malevolent force drawn to the site of tragedy? I still drive trucks. It's in my blood, and I'm too old to learn a new trade. But I've never taken another midnight run through Nevada, and every year on July 15th I make sure I'm home, doors locked and shades drawn, because I know now that out there on the lonely highways in the darkest hours of the night there are things that defy explanation, echoes of past tragedies that refuse to fade away. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear them calling out, still searching for resolution. I've told this story to a few other truckers over the years. Most laugh it off, call it a ghost story to scare the newbies. But every once in a while, I'll see a flicker of recognition in someone's eyes. A hint that maybe, just maybe, they've heard that phantom horn too. So if you're ever driving through the Mojave on a moonless night and you hear a truck horn when the clock strikes 12, don't look back. Don't slow down. Just keep driving and hope that whatever's out there isn't coming for you. Because in the vast emptiness of the desert night, where the past and present blur like lines on the highway, there are sounds that can reach out across the years. Sounds that carry the weight of unresolved guilt, of justice unserved. Sounds that once heard will haunt you for the rest of your days. And somewhere out there, on a stretch of I-15 that doesn't appear on any modern map, a black Peterbilt waits. Its horn ready to sound, carrying a half-century-old warning to anyone who will listen. A reminder that on the loneliest highways, at the darkest hour, the ghosts of the past are never far behind. In all my years of long-haul trucking, I've seen things that would make your skin crawl. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me on that godforsaken stretch of I-40 just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. It was the night I learned that some roads are haunted by more than just memories, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing on the highway isn't what you can see, but what you can't. It was a crisp October night, the kind where the moon hangs low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I was hauling a load of electronics from Albuquerque to Los Angeles, making good time despite the late hour. The cab of my Peterbilt was quiet, save for the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. As I approached Flagstaff, I noticed something odd. A thick fog had rolled in, unusual for the high desert. It clung to the road like a living thing, swirling in my headlights. I slowed down, squinting to make out the lane markers. That's when I saw it. An overpass looming out of the mist, its concrete supports stark and ghostly in the moonlight. There was something off about it. The architecture looked outdated, like something from the 1950s, and despite the fog, I could see it with an unnatural clarity. As I drew closer, a chill ran down my spine. The overpass was empty. No cars, no lights, not even a street sign. Just a bare stretch of concrete suspended over the highway. I keyed my mic, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. Breaker 1-9, this is Big John. Anybody else seeing this weird overpass outside Flagstaff? Silence. Not even static. I was almost under it now. The fog had thickened, pressing against my windows like it was trying to get in. And then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. The screech of tires, the crunch of metal on metal, and underneath it all, a woman's scream cut terrifyingly short. I slammed on the brakes, my rig skidding on the suddenly slick road. As I fought to keep control, I caught a glimpse of something in my side mirror. A car, an old model, plummeting from the overpass. I could see the driver, a woman with long dark hair, her mouth open in a silent scream. I blinked and it was gone. The fog cleared as suddenly as it had appeared, revealing an empty stretch of highway. No overpass, no falling car, nothing but the Arizona night and the distant lights of Flagstaff. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the idling engine. What the hell had just happened? Was I hallucinating from too many hours on the road? I rubbed my eyes, half expecting the scene to reappear. But there was nothing. Just an ordinary stretch of I-40, bathed in moonlight. Shaken, I pulled into the next rest stop I saw. As I sat in my cab, hands still trembling on the wheel, an old-timer approached. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime on the road. "You all right there, son?" he called out. "You came in looking like you'd seen a ghost." I hesitated, then decided to tell him what I'd seen. As I spoke, the old man's face grew grave. When I finished, he let out a long, slow whistle. "You're not the first to see it," he said, his voice low. "That overpass, it ain't been there for nigh on 60 years, not since the accident." He went on to tell me a story that made my blood run cold. Back in 1962, there was an overpass on that stretch of road. One night, a young woman was driving across it when her car went off the edge. They never found out why. Mechanical failure, driver error, or something more sinister. The woman died on impact. After that, the old-timer continued, strange things started happening. Truckers reported seeing the accident over and over, always at night, always in the fog. The state tore down the overpass a year later, said it was structurally unsound. But some folks say it's still there. You just can't always see it. I sat there for a long time after the old man left, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, a trick of the light and too many hours on the road. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real, or at least as real as something like that could be. As dawn broke, I pulled back onto the highway, my mind still reeling. The morning sun banished the last of the night's shadows, making the whole experience feel like a bad dream. But as I passed the spot where I'd seen the phantom overpass, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. That was 5 years ago. I still drive that route sometimes when I have to, but I always make sure to pass through Flagstaff in the daylight. And on foggy nights, when the moon is full and the shadows seem to move on their own, I find myself watching the shoulder of the road, half expecting to see concrete pillars rising out of the mist. I've heard other stories since then. Whispers from other truckers about strange sights on lonely highways, phantom hitchhikers, ghost trucks, stretches of road that seem to go on forever. Most of the time, I try to dismiss them as tall tales, the kind of stories we tell to keep ourselves awake on long hauls. But sometimes in the dead of night, when it's just me and the endless ribbon of asphalt, I remember that overpass. I remember the sound of screeching tires and a scream cut short. And I wonder about the woman in the falling car. Is she still out there, endlessly reliving her final moments? Or is she trying to warn us to prevent others from sharing her fate? I don't have answers. But I do know this. The highways we travel are more than just roads. They're veins of history, arteries pumping with the lifeblood of countless journeys, countless stories. And sometimes, just sometimes, the past bleeds through into the present. So if you're ever driving through Arizona on a moonlit night and you see an overpass that doesn't look quite right, do yourself a favor. Don't slow down. Don't look too closely. Just keep driving and hope that whatever echoes of the past are out there, they don't decide to hitch a ride with you. Because out on the highway, not everything is as it seems. The lines between past and present, between the living and the dead, can blur like the yellow lines on the road. And sometimes the most haunting journeys are the ones that never truly end. I still drive trucks. It's in my blood and I'm too old to learn a new trade. But I've changed since that night. I'm more aware of the world around me, more open to the possibilities of what might exist beyond our understanding. And every time I pass an overpass, especially at night, I say a little prayer. For myself, for the woman in the falling car, and for all the lost souls still traveling roads that no longer exist. Because in the end, we're all just passing through. And on the loneliest stretches of highway, in the darkest hours of the night, the barriers between this world and the next can be as thin as the fog that rolls in from nowhere. So keep your eyes on the road, your hands on the wheel, and if you hear a scream on the wind or see something impossible in your rearview mirror, just remember, not all ghost stories are fiction, and not all highways lead to places on any map. Drive safe out there, and whatever you do, don't stop under the overpass. They say technology is supposed to make our lives easier, but let me tell you, sometimes it can lead you straight into a nightmare. I've been driving trucks for over 2 decades, seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road, but nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me last spring on a routine haul through the Appalachians. It was the night I learned that sometimes the voice telling you where to go isn't just a computer, and it might not have your best interests in mind. It started like any other long-haul run. I was taking a load of auto parts from Detroit to Atlanta, a route I'd driven 100 times before. My rig was in top shape, the weather was clear, and I had a brand new GPS system my company had just installed. State of the art, they said. Would make navigation a breeze, they said. If only they knew. I hit the road just as the sun was setting, the sky a brilliant orange fading to deep purple. The first few hours were smooth sailing. The GPS had a pleasant female voice, calm and authoritative. I named her Sally, found myself chatting with her to pass the time. Silly, I know, but those long nights on the road can get lonely. It was around midnight when things started to get strange. I was deep in the mountains of West Virginia, the road a twisting ribbon of black through the densely forested hills. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. That's when Sally's voice changed. It was subtle at first, an odd inflection here, a strangely pronounced word there. I shook my head, figuring I was just tired. But then, "Turn right in 100 meters, Sally said, her voice deeper than before, with a static-like quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I frowned. There was no right turn coming up, just a solid guardrail and a sheer drop down the mountainside. "Sally, there's no turn here," I said, feeling a bit foolish for talking to a GPS. "Turn right now," the voice growled, all pretense of the pleasant female assistant gone. It was a harsh, guttural sound that seemed to fill the cab. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. What the hell was going on? Suddenly the truck lurched to the right like something had grabbed the wheel. I fought for control, adrenaline surging through me as I wrestled the rig back into the lane. As soon as I was straight, the force vanished. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the engine. I reached out with a shaking hand to turn off the GPS, but as my fingers touched the power button, a jolt of electricity shot up my arm. The screen flickered, and for a split second I could have sworn I saw a face twisted, angry, its mouth open in a silent scream. "You can't get rid of me that easily, John," the voice said, using my name for the first time. "We're going for a ride." The GPS screen went black, then lit up with a route I'd never seen before. It was taking me off the highway at the next exit, down a series of increasingly smaller roads. "I'm not following that," I said firmly, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The voice laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Oh, but you are, one way or another." As if on cue, my truck began to move on its own. The gas pedal pressed down, the wheel turned, and we were heading down the exit ramp. I tried to hit the brakes, but they were unresponsive. It was like the truck had a mind of its own, or like something else was controlling it. We sped down a 2-lane country road, then turned onto a gravel path barely wide enough for my rig. Trees pressed in on both sides, branches scraping against the cab like skeletal fingers. All the while, that voice kept talking. "Almost there, John, almost home." I was in full panic mode now, yanking at the useless wheel, stomping on dead pedals. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that trucks don't drive themselves and GPS systems don't talk like demons. But there was no denying what was happening. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we burst into a clearing. In the center stood an old house, paint peeling, windows dark. The truck rolled to a stop in front of it. "We're here," the voice said, almost gleeful. "Home, sweet home." The engine cut off, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the voice spoke again, softer now, almost sad. "Do you remember this place, John?" I stared at the house, a sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. It did look familiar, but I couldn't place it. "You should," the voice continued. "You lived here, a long time ago." And suddenly it all came rushing back. This was my childhood home, the place I'd grown up, the place I'd fled from as soon as I was old enough to drive, the place where your sister died, the voice finished my thought. "Where you let her die." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Sarah, my little sister, the accident. It had been so long ago I'd almost convinced myself it was just a bad dream. "It wasn't my fault," I whispered, but the old guilt was rising up, threatening to choke me. "But it was," the voice insisted. "You were supposed to be watching her. You were supposed to keep her safe." The GPS screen flickered again, and this time the face that appeared was clear. Sarah, as she looked the day she died, her eyes accusing. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Sarah." The face on the screen softened, just a little. "I know," Sarah's voice said, all trace of the demonic growl gone. "But sorry isn't enough. You ran away, John. You never dealt with what happened, and now it's time to face it." The doors of my truck unlocked with a loud click. "Go inside," Sarah said. "Face your past. It's the only way you'll ever be free." I sat there for a long time, staring at the dark house, wrestling with decades of buried guilt and grief. Finally, I took a deep breath and opened the door. The next few hours were the hardest of my life. I walked through that old house, memories flooding back with every step. I remembered the good times, Sarah's laugh, the games we used to play. And I remembered the bad, the accident, the aftermath, the way our family fell apart. I talked to Sarah, or whatever part of her was in that GPS. I cried, I raged, I begged for forgiveness. And slowly, as the night wore on, I began to feel something lift. A weight I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, I made my way back to the truck. The GPS screen was dark, and when I turned the key, it lit up with its normal display. Sally's pleasant voice gave me directions back to the highway as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had changed. I felt lighter somehow, free. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who'd believe me? But I keep that GPS unit, even though the company's replaced it twice since then. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through lonely country, I could swear I hear Sarah's voice, faint but clear. "Be safe, big brother, I love you." I'm still driving trucks. It's what I do, who I am. But I drive differently now. More aware, more present. Because I know that the roads we travel aren't just physical paths, they're journeys through our past, our fears, our unresolved pain. And sometimes, if we're lucky, they can lead us to healing. So if you're ever out on the road at night and your GPS starts acting funny, pay attention. It might not be taking you where you think you're going, but it might just be leading you exactly where you need to be. They say Route 491 is cursed. They say it's taken more lives than any other stretch of asphalt in the country. But I never believed in curses or ghost stories, at least not until that night in June when I saw it with my own eyes. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and burnt rubber as I pulled into the truck stop just outside Cortez, Colorado. My rig's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a handful of other trucks scattered across the lot. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, and my eyes felt like they were full of sand. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal. That's when I first heard the whispers. Two drivers were huddled near the fuel pumps, their voices low and urgent. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but a few words drifted my way. Accident, 491, and ghost truck. Now, I'm not one for gossip, but something in their tone made me pause. I climbed down from my cab, my boots hitting the cracked pavement with a thud. "Evening, fellas," I called out, approaching them. Couldn't help but overhear. "What's this about a ghost truck?" The older of the two, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard, eyed me warily. "You ain't heard about Route 491? I shook my head. "Just passing through, what's the story?" The younger driver, barely out of his 20s, spoke up. "It's cursed, man. They used to call it Route 666 before they changed the number, but changing the sign didn't change what's out there." The older driver nodded solemnly. "There's a truck out there, blacker than a moonless night. No lights, no plates. It appears out of nowhere, runs folks off the road, then vanishes into thin air." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Come on, guys, ghost stories. We're grown men." The older driver's eyes hardened. "Laugh if you want, son, but I've seen it. Lost my buddy Chuck to that demon rig 10 years ago. Ran him right off Devil's Highway and into a ravine. By the time help arrived, there wasn't much left of him or his truck." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm June night. "Devil's Highway?" "That's what the locals call it," the younger driver chimed in. "It's a 200-mile stretch between here and Monticello, Utah. More accidents and fatalities than any other road in America." I shook my head, trying to clear away the unease creeping over me. "Look, I appreciate the warning, but I've got a deadline to meet. My route takes me straight up 491 tonight." The older driver grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me, boy. If you value your life, you'll find another way. Or at least wait till morning." I gently pulled away. "I can't afford the delay, but I'll keep an eye out for your ghost truck." As I walked back to my rig, their whispers followed me. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread settling in my gut. Ghost stories were for campfires and kids, not grown men with jobs to do. An hour later, I was barreling down Route 491, the yellow lines disappearing under my hood in a hypnotic rhythm. The road stretched out before me, empty and dark. The only light came from my high beams and the occasional glimmer of stars peeking through the clouds. I flipped on the radio, hoping some music would chase away the lingering unease from the truck stop conversation. Static crackled through the speakers, punctuated by bursts of garbled voices. I frowned, fiddling with the dial, but every station was the same, just static and indecipherable whispers. That's when I saw it, a pinprick of light in my rearview mirror growing larger by the second. My heart rate picked up as I watched the headlights approach. There hadn't been another vehicle for miles, and now suddenly this truck was bearing down on me like a freight train. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my palms suddenly slick with sweat. The rational part of my brain told me it was just another trucker, probably running late like me. But a deeper primal part screamed danger. The headlights grew larger, filling my mirrors with blinding white light. I pressed down on the accelerator, but it was no use. The truck behind me ate up the distance like it was standing still. Just as I braced for impact, the lights vanished. 1 second they were there, filling my world with searing brightness, and the next, nothing. Just empty darkness behind me. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I scanned the mirrors frantically. There was no way a truck that size could have just disappeared. I eased off the gas, half expecting to see it materialize again at any moment. That's when I noticed the temperature in the cab dropping. My breath fogged in front of me, and ice crystals began to form on the inside of the windshield. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static that made me jump in my seat. Through the white noise, I heard a voice, low and gravelly, filled with a despair that made my blood run cold. "Turn back." I jerked the wheel, nearly sending the truck into a skid as I pulled onto the shoulder. My hands shook as I fumbled for the CB radio. "This is northbound on 491. Did anybody else see that? Over." Silence answered me. Not even static. Just a deep, oppressive quiet that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I sat there for what felt like hours, engine idling, straining my eyes against the darkness. Part of me wanted to turn around, to put as much distance between myself and this cursed stretch of road as possible. But the larger part, the part that prided itself on logic and reason, insisted it had all been a trick of my tired mind. Finally, I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road. My nerves were shot, every shadow on the roadside looking like it might solidify into that phantom truck at any moment. I'd gone maybe 10 miles when I saw the glow of taillights ahead. Relief flooded through me at this sign of another human being. As I drew closer, I realized it was another semi, running dark except for the red lights at the rear. I eased up behind it, taking comfort in following another truck through the night. But as the miles ticked by, something started to feel off. The truck ahead never varied its speed, never drifted slightly in its lane like a human driver would. It was almost as if it was being driven by a machine, maintaining a perfect line down the center of its lane. A creeping sense of wrongness settled over me. I backed off a bit, putting more distance between us. That's when I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. There was no license plate on the rear of the truck, just a blank metal panel where the plate should have been. My hands began to shake as I remembered the words of the driver at the truck stop. Blacker than a moonless night, no lights, no plates. I eased my foot off the gas, letting my truck slow. But as my speed dropped, so did the truck ahead of me, matching my pace perfectly. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was staring at the back of the very thing I'd been warned about. Suddenly, the phantom truck's brake lights flared to life. I stomped on my own brakes, the trailer behind me threatening to jackknife as I fought to keep control. The ghost truck stopped impossibly fast, defying all laws of physics. I wrenched the wheel to the side, my truck screaming as it skidded onto the shoulder. For a sickening moment, I thought I was going over. The world tilted crazily, gravel spraying against the undercarriage. Then with a bone-jarring thud, my rig slammed back onto all 18 wheels. I sat there, chest heaving, knuckles white on the steering wheel. The phantom truck was gone, vanished into thin air as if it had never existed. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone to call for help. But as the screen lit up, my blood ran cold. There, in stark digital numbers, was the date, June 15th, 2013. My mind reeled. That couldn't be right. When I'd started my journey, it had been 2023. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. But the date remained unchanged. As the first rays of dawn began to color the eastern sky, I sat in my idling truck, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I somehow slipped through time? Or had I imagined the whole thing? I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I heard the rumble of another truck approaching. An old Peterbilt pulled up alongside me and a weather-beaten face peered out the window. "You all right there, son?" the driver called out. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I explain what I'd experienced? Who would believe me? The old driver's expression softened. "Let me guess. You had a run-in with the 491 Phantom?" I nodded mutely. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "You're lucky to be alive, kid. That thing's claimed more drivers than I care to count. Come on, follow me to the next truck stop. You look like you could use a hot meal and a strong cup of coffee." As I pulled back onto the road, following the reassuring bulk of the Peterbilt, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brushed up against something beyond my understanding. The ghost truck was real, and it had let me go for reasons I couldn't fathom. One thing was certain: I'd never drive Route 491 again. Some roads are better left untraveled, some stories better left untold. But I know what I saw that night, and I'll carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my days. The first thing I noticed about Millbrook was the silence. No birds chirping, no dogs barking, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just an eerie, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow up every sound my rig made as I rolled into town. But it wasn't until I saw the faces, all those identical faces, that I knew I'd stumbled into something straight out of the Twilight Zone. It was supposed to be a routine drop-off, just another small town on my cross-country route. The GPS had guided me off the main highway and onto a series of increasingly narrow roads until I found myself on what passed for Millbrook's Main Street. The faded sign welcoming me to town claimed a population of 1,200, but as I eased my semi past shuttered storefronts and overgrown lawns, it felt more like a ghost town. I pulled up in front of what my manifest listed as Millbrook General Store, killing the engine and sitting for a moment in the sudden silence. The store's windows were dark, but a hand-painted "Open" sign hung crookedly on the door. I checked my watch, 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Shouldn't there be some signs of life? With a sigh, I climbed down from the cab, stretching muscles stiff from hours of driving. The air felt thick, almost soupy, and carried a faint chemical smell I couldn't quite place. I grabbed my clipboard and headed for the store's entrance, boots crunching on gravel that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The bell above the door gave a half-hearted jingle as I stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight cutting through grimy windows, giving the cluttered interior a dreamy, suspended-in-time quality. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding muffled and strange. "Got a delivery here for, Mr. Johnson?" For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then from somewhere in the back of the store came the sound of shuffling footsteps. A man emerged from behind a sagging shelf of canned goods. He was maybe in his 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. But it was his face that made me take an involuntary step back. There was something off about it. The features were just a little too symmetrical, the skin a shade too smooth. It was like looking at a portrait that had been ever so slightly touched up, edging into the uncanny valley. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice as bland and unremarkable as his appearance. "The delivery, right on time." I forced a smile, trying to shake off my unease. "Just need a signature here, Mr. Johnson, and I'll start unloading." He took the clipboard, his movements stiff and precise. As he signed, I noticed his hands. They were unnaturally smooth, like a mannequin's. "Please," he said, handing back the clipboard. "Call me David. Everyone here does." I nodded, not quite meeting his unsettling gaze. "Right, well, I'll just go grab the first load then." As I turned to leave, the bell jingled again. A woman entered, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. She was the spitting image of David. Same close-cropped gray hair, same wire-rimmed glasses, same unnaturally smooth features. The only difference was the floral print dress she wore instead of David's button-down and slacks. "Ah, hello, dear," David said, his tone unchanged. "Our delivery has arrived." The woman, I assumed his wife, smiled at me. It was the exact same smile David had given me moments before, right down to the slight crinkle at the corners of the eyes. "Welcome to Millbrook," she said. "I'm David. Everyone here is—" I mumbled something about getting started on unloading and practically bolted for the door. Outside, I leaned against my truck, taking deep breaths of the strange-smelling air. What the hell was going on in this town? As I started unloading boxes, more people began to appear on the street. A jogger trotted past, then a woman walking a dog, followed by a teenager on a bike. Every single one of them had the same face, David's face. Men, women, even children, all with those eerily smooth features, those wire-rimmed glasses, that close-cropped gray hair. My hands shook as I carried boxes into the store. David, the original David, directed me where to put things while his wife/clone/whatever she was restocked shelves. Neither seemed to notice my growing panic. "Lovely day, isn't it?" one of them commented. I couldn't even tell which one had spoken. "Yeah," I managed, "real nice." As I worked, more Davids filtered into the store. They chatted with each other in those bland, identical voices, discussing the weather, someone's garden, an upcoming town meeting. It was like watching the world's most mundane play performed by a cast of clones. I've seen some strange things in my years on the road, but nothing like this. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of bizarre cult? A government experiment gone wrong, or had I finally cracked, hallucinating this whole surreal scene? I was on my last load of boxes when I heard a commotion outside. A group of Davids had gathered around my truck, pointing and murmuring in their eerie unison. As I approached, I saw what had caught their attention, a small puddle of oil beneath my rig. "Oh dear," one of the Davids said, "that doesn't look good." "Not good at all," another chimed in. "You can't drive like that, it wouldn't be safe." "Don't worry," a third added. "We have an excellent mechanic here in Millbrook. David can take a look at it first thing in the morning." My heart sank. The thought of spending the night in this town of doppelgangers made my skin crawl. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but I really need to get back on the road. I'm sure it'll hold until I reach the next town." The Davids exchanged glances, their identical faces creasing with identical frowns. "We really must insist," the first David said, his tone firmer now. "We can't in good conscience let you leave in an unsafe vehicle. What kind of hosts would we be?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat as I realized I was surrounded. More Davids had appeared, forming a loose circle around me and my truck. Their faces were still plastered with those pleasant, empty smiles, but there was something undeniably menacing about the way they hemmed me in. "Come now," one said, placing a too-smooth hand on my arm. "Let's get you settled at the inn. David runs it, you know. Makes the most wonderful blueberry pancakes for breakfast." As they began to herd me down the street, my mind raced. I had to get out of here, had to warn someone about what was happening in Millbrook. But who would believe me? And more importantly, how could I escape a town full of people who all looked exactly alike? The Millbrook Inn was a Victorian-style house with peeling paint and sagging shutters. Yet another David greeted me at the door, ushering me into a musty-smelling foyer. "We don't get many visitors," he said, leading me up a creaking staircase. "But we always enjoy the company." The room he showed me to was small and sparsely furnished, with faded floral wallpaper and a narrow bed. The window, I noticed with a sinking feeling, had been painted shut. "Dinner's at 6, the innkeeper David informed me. "We eat together like a big family. You'll join us, won't you?" It wasn't really a question. As he closed the door behind him, I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. I spent the next few hours pacing the small room, alternating between panic and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Places like this didn't exist in the real world. Any minute now, I'd wake up in my truck at some rest stop, the whole thing nothing but a bizarre dream. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, I had to face the fact that this was all too real. I was trapped in a town full of identical people, all of whom seemed determined to keep me here. At precisely 6 o'clock, there was a knock at my door. When I didn't answer, I heard the key turn in the lock. The innkeeper David stood there, still wearing that placid smile. "Dinner time," he said. "Everyone's so excited to meet you." I thought about refusing, about barricading myself in the room. But what good would it do? I was outnumbered and outsmarted. My only hope was to play along, to look for an opportunity to escape. So I followed him downstairs to a large dining room. A long table dominated the space, surrounded by at least 30 Davids. They all turned to look at me as I entered, a sea of identical faces regarding me with identical expressions of mild interest. "Welcome," they said in unison, the word echoing eerily in the high-ceilinged room. As I took my seat, plates of food began to be passed around. Everything looked normal enough: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. But that chemical smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger here, seeming to emanate from the steaming dishes. "Eat up," the David next to me urged. "You must be hungry after your long drive." I pushed the food around on my plate, my appetite long gone. The Davids chatted amongst themselves, a surreal chorus of the same voice discussing mundane topics. I caught snippets about weather patterns, crop yields, and something called the treatment that seemed to be a regular occurrence in town. "So," one of the Davids finally addressed me directly, "what do you think of our little town?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's unique. I've never seen anywhere quite like it." This elicited a chorus of pleased murmurs from around the table. "We're very proud of what we've built here," another David chimed in. "A perfect community, free from conflict, free from difference." "Everyone the same," added another. "Everyone equal." I nodded weakly, my mind racing. I had to get out of here, had to find a way to contact the outside world. But as I looked around at the sea of identical faces, I realized with a sinking feeling that even if I did escape, even if I did manage to tell someone about Millbrook, who would believe me? As the meal wound down, the innkeeper David stood up, tapping his glass for attention. "Friends," he said, "we have an exciting announcement. Our guest has decided to stay with us, permanently." My blood ran cold as every David in the room turned to look at me, those unnaturally smooth faces split by wide, identical grins. "The treatment is scheduled for tomorrow morning," the innkeeper continued. "Soon you'll be one of us. Won't that be wonderful?" As the Davids began to applaud, their eerie, synchronized clapping filling the room, I knew with grim certainty that I had to find a way out of Millbrook. And I had to do it tonight, or I might never leave this town of clones at all. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought I was losing my mind. But by the third night in Uncle Jack's old Peterbilt, I knew the cab was haunted. What I didn't know was that the ghost had a message, one that would save my life and dozens of others. It all started when I got the call about Uncle Jack's passing. We hadn't been close in years, not since I was a kid riding shotgun in his big rig during summer breaks. But apparently I was his only living relative, and he'd left me everything, including his prized 1979 Peterbilt 359. I'd been between jobs, scraping by on odd delivery gigs with my beat-up Ford, so inheriting a semi seemed like a godsend. Sure, it was old, but Uncle Jack had always taken immaculate care of his baby. I figured I could make some real money with this beast. The lawyer handed me the keys with a strange look. Jack was particular about that truck. Said it had a mind of its own sometimes. Just be careful out there, all right? I laughed it off at the time. Uncle Jack had always been a bit eccentric, full of wild stories about his days on the road. I should have paid more attention. The first few days with the Peterbilt were uneventful. It ran like a dream, purring down the highway like it was fresh off the assembly line. I landed a good long-haul contract, and for the first time in months, things were looking up. It was on the third night, somewhere in the middle of Nevada, that things got weird. I'd pulled into a rest stop for a few hours of shut-eye. The cab was quiet except for the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of semis on the highway. I was just drifting off when I heard it, a whisper so faint I almost missed it. "Danger ahead!" My eyes snapped open. The cab was empty, the parking lot outside deserted. Must have been dreaming, I told myself. But sleep didn't come easy after that. The next night it happened again. This time I was wide awake, rolling through Wyoming under a canopy of stars. The radio was off, nothing but the steady rumble of tires on asphalt. "Listen." I nearly jerked the wheel off the road. The voice was clearer this time, a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I pulled over, heart pounding, and tore the cab apart, looking for some kind of hidden speaker. A forgotten CB radio, anything that could explain what I'd heard. Nothing. By the fifth night, I was a wreck. The whispers came more frequently now, always just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out most of it, just fragments. Warning. Be ready. Lives at stake. I thought about abandoning the rig, contract be damned, but something kept me going. Call it stubbornness, call it desperation, but I couldn't let this truck beat me. And if I was being honest with myself, a part of me was curious. What was this warning the voice kept trying to give? It all came to a head on a rainy night in the Appalachians. I was hauling a load of electronics, taking a twisty mountain road that had my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The rain was coming down in sheets, visibility near zero. That's when I heard it, clear as day. Stop the truck. I slammed on the brakes without thinking, the trailer fishtailing behind me. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought we were going over the edge. Then the Peterbilt shuddered to a halt, mere inches from the guardrail. And not a second too soon. Through the curtain of rain, my headlights illuminated a massive rock slide completely blocking the road ahead. If I'd been going any faster, I'd have plowed right into it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone to call it in. That's when I noticed something odd. The date on my phone was wrong. It showed October 15th, 2013. That can't be right, I muttered. It had been 2023 when I started this trip. The whisper came again, softer now. 10 years. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain. Uncle Jack? I whispered. The voice that answered was faint but unmistakable. The same gruff drawl I remembered from childhood. Took you long enough to figure it out, kiddo. I let out a shaky laugh, caught between disbelief and relief. I thought I was going crazy. Nah, just thick-headed. Must run in the family. There was a warmth to the ghostly voice, a hint of the uncle I'd known. Sorry for scaring you, but I had to get your attention somehow. Why? I asked. What's going on? The cab grew colder, and I could have sworn I felt a hand on my shoulder. Something bad happened here 10 years ago to the day. A wreck, bunch of cars plowed into a rock slide just like this one. 17 people died. My blood ran cold. And you stopped it from happening again? We stopped it, kiddo. I just provided the warning. You're the one who hit the brakes. I sat there in stunned silence, the rain drumming on the roof. Part of me still couldn't believe this was happening, that I was having a conversation with my dead uncle's ghost in a haunted semi-truck. But after everything I'd experienced over the past week, I was ready to believe just about anything. So what now? I finally asked. Now? I could almost hear the smile in Uncle Jack's voice. Now you do what truckers do best. You keep on trucking. Over the next hour, as we waited for the road crew to clear the slide, Uncle Jack filled me in on the details. He'd been there that night 10 years ago, one of the first on the scene after the accident. The memory of it had haunted him ever since. When I knew my time was coming, he explained, I made a deal. Said I'd stick around, haunt this old girl for a while if it meant I could prevent it from happening again. Didn't know it'd be you behind the wheel, though. That was a nice surprise. I thought about the lawyer's cryptic warning, about all those nights I'd spent thinking I was losing my mind. You could have just told me straight out, you know, instead of all the creepy whispers. Uncle Jack's laughter filled the cab. Where's the fun in that? Besides, would you have believed me if I'd just popped up and said, "Boo, I'm a ghost"? He had a point there. As the first rays of dawn began to break through the clouds, I saw flashing lights approaching. The road crew had arrived. Looks like this is where I get off, kiddo, Uncle Jack said, his voice already starting to fade. You take care of my baby, you hear, and yourself? Wait, I called out. Will I ever hear from you again? There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he was already gone. Then faintly, keep an ear out on those long night hauls. Never know when you might need a co-pilot. And just like that, the presence I'd felt in the cab vanished. As I watched the road crew clear away the last of the rocks, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite sort out: grief, gratitude, and a strange sense of peace. The next few days were a blur of police reports, insurance claims, and news interviews. The story of the trucker's premonition that saved countless lives made headlines across the state. Nobody but me knew the truth, and I wasn't about to try explaining it. As I finally got back on the road, continuing my run with a new appreciation for this old Peterbilt, I couldn't help but smile. Uncle Jack had always said trucking was in our blood. Turns out not even death could keep him off the road. These days I don't mind the long, lonely night hauls so much. Sometimes when the moon is high and the highway stretches out endlessly before me, I swear I can still hear a faint whisper on the wind. It might be my imagination, or it might be Uncle Jack still riding shotgun after all these years. Either way, I keep on trucking. It's what we do in this family, in life, and apparently even after. I've been driving trucks for 20 years, and I've seen some strange things on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for that rainy night on Route 87, when a simple act of kindness almost cost me everything. They say no good deed goes unpunished, but they never tell you that sometimes the punishment comes with a knife and a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. It was well past midnight, and I was pushing through the last leg of a long haul from Boise to Albany. The rain had been coming down in sheets for hours, turning the world outside my windshield into a blur of watery darkness punctuated by the occasional flash of lightning. I was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that makes your eyes burn and your thoughts fuzzy around the edges. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, arm outstretched, thumb raised in the universal sign of a hitchhiker. In any other circumstance, I would have driven right past. You don't pick up strangers in this line of work, not if you want to live to see retirement. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the rain, or the lateness of the hour, or just plain old human decency winning out over common sense. I eased my rig onto the shoulder, brakes hissing as I came to a stop. The figure approached, resolving into a man probably in his early 30s, drenched to the bone and carrying a battered duffel bag. He had a friendly face, the kind you'd expect to see behind the counter at a small-town hardware store, not thumbing rides in the middle of nowhere at 1 a.m. "Appreciate it, mister," he said as he climbed into the cab. "Didn't think anyone would stop on a night like this." I grunted in response, already regretting my decision as the smell of wet clothes and something else, something metallic and unpleasant, filled the confined space. "Where you headed?" "Just up to the next town, if it's not too much trouble," he replied, flashing a smile that was all white teeth and boyish charm. "Name's Eddie, by the way." "Tom," I said, pulling back onto the highway. "What brings you out here in this weather, Eddie?" He laughed, a sound that should have been warm but somehow sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, you know how it is. Sometimes life takes an unexpected turn and you find yourself places you never thought you'd be." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. The rain was letting up a bit, but visibility was still poor. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady thrum of tires on wet asphalt and the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers. "So, Tom," Eddie said after a few miles, his voice casual, "you been driving long?" "About 20 years now," I replied, not taking my eyes off the road. "Must see all sorts of interesting things out here on the road, huh? Meet all kinds of people?" Something in his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced over at him, trying to keep my voice neutral. Mostly just long stretches of highway and truck stops, to be honest. Eddie nodded, that too wide smile still plastered on his face. "But surely you must have some stories. A man in your line of work, all alone out here? I bet you could make someone disappear real easy if you wanted to." My hands tightened on the wheel. "Not really my area of expertise," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just drive the truck." Eddie laughed again, but this time there was no mistaking the menace behind it. "Come on now, Tom. No need to be modest. I bet you've got all sorts of secrets tucked away in that cab of yours. Maybe even a few bodies buried along the roadside, HMA. I felt my heart rate pick up, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. This wasn't just idle chatter anymore. Eddie was fishing for something, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what it was. "Look, buddy," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. "I don't know what you're getting at, but I'm just a regular trucker trying to make a living. No secrets, no bodies, nothing like that." Eddie's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of cold calculation that was far more terrifying than any threat could have been. "That's a shame, Tom. Here I thought we might have something in common. But if you're just a regular trucker, well, I suppose you won't mind if I take a look in your trailer, will you?" My mind raced. The trailer was empty. I dropped off my last load hours ago, but something told me that letting Eddie anywhere near the back of my truck would be a fatal mistake. Can't do that, I said, trying to sound apologetic rather than terrified. Company policy, no unauthorized access to the cargo area. Eddie clicked his tongue, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher. Now, Tom, don't make this difficult. I'd hate for things to get messy. That's when I saw it, the glint of metal in his hand. A knife wickedly sharp and all too real. My blood ran cold as I realized just how badly I'd misjudged the situation. This wasn't just some creepy hitchhiker. This was something far worse. "All right, Eddie," I said, my mouth dry. "Why don't you tell me what this is really about?" He grinned, and in that moment he looked less like a man and more like a predator that had just cornered its prey. Smart guy, I like that. Here's the deal, Tom. I've got a little problem I need to take care of, and that big empty trailer of yours is just what I need to make it disappear. My mind raced, trying to figure a way out of this nightmare. We were miles from anywhere, no other cars on the road. If I tried to fight, there was a good chance I'd end up bleeding out in a ditch. If I went along with his plan, I'd be an accessory to God knows what kind of crime. "Eddie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "whatever you've done, whatever you're planning, it's not too late to walk away. I can let you out right here, we'll go our separate ways, and nobody has to get hurt." He laughed, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Oh, Tom, you really don't get it, do you? There's no walking away from this. Now pull over before I decide to paint the inside of this cab a new color." I saw a turnoff ahead, a narrow dirt road leading off into the darkness. With no other options, I took it, the truck bouncing and swaying as we left the smooth asphalt behind. "Good boy," Eddie said, the knife never wavering. "Now let's go take a look at that trailer of yours." As we climbed down from the cab, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. In any other circumstance, it might have been peaceful. Now it felt like the setting for a horror movie. Eddie marched me to the back of the trailer, the knife pressed against my ribs. "Open it up," he ordered. My hands shook as I unlocked the rear doors, swinging them open to reveal the empty interior. Eddie's eyes gleamed in the dim light, a look of satisfaction crossing his face. "Perfect," he muttered. "Absolutely perfect." That's when I heard it, a muffled sound coming from Eddie's duffel bag. A sound that made my blood run cold, a human sound. Eddie must have seen the realization in my eyes because his grin widened. "Don't worry, Tom. You're not going to have to haul this cargo far. There's a nice deep ravine about 20 miles up the road. By the time anyone finds what's left, you and I will be long gone." In that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I could go along with Eddie's plan, become an unwilling accomplice in whatever horrific crime he was trying to cover up. Or I could fight back, knowing full well it might cost me my life. I'd like to say I made a conscious decision, that I weighed the options and chose the path of righteousness. But the truth is, my body acted before my mind had a chance to catch up. 20 years of loading and unloading cargo had given me muscles that desk jobs just can't match. Before Eddie could react, I swung the heavy trailer door, catching him square in the face. He went down hard, the knife clattering away into the darkness. I was on him in an instant, using my weight to pin him down as I scrambled for something to tie him up with. In the struggle, his duffel bag came open, and I saw a glimpse of what was inside. A bound and gagged woman, her eyes wide with terror. The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights and police sirens. Turns out Eddie was wanted in 3 states for a string of abductions and murders. The woman in the bag, Lisa, had been his latest victim. She'd managed to work her gag loose and make that muffled sound that had given Eddie away. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, one of the detectives approached me. "You took one hell of a risk, Mr. Henderson," he said, "but you saved that woman's life. Probably saved a lot of other lives down the line, too." I nodded, still trying to process everything that had happened. "I just did what anyone would do," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Not everyone would have stopped on that rainy night. Not everyone would have fought back when the knife came out. The detective smiled, patting me on the shoulder. "Well, whatever your reasons, you're a hero. Don't forget that." As I watched them load Eddie into a police car, his face a mask of rage and hate, I couldn't help but think about all the what-ifs. What if I hadn't stopped? What if I had just given in to Eddie's demands? What if I hadn't heard that muffled cry? In the end, I suppose it doesn't matter. We make our choices and we live with the consequences. That night on Route 87 taught me that sometimes the right choice and the easy choice are worlds apart. But it also taught me that even in the darkest moments when all hope seems lost, there's always a chance to do the right thing. These days, I still pick up the occasional hitchhiker. But I keep a tire iron within easy reach, and I listen real careful for any strange sounds coming from their luggage. After all, you never know when a simple act of kindness might turn into a fight for survival. And out here on the open road, sometimes the only person you can count on is yourself.